want to discuss a couple of recent updates. First off, the coronavirus update there, an update on digital LSAT prep. And then I want to take some time to discuss the mindset of a 170 plus scorer, what that looks like. Because even if you're not aiming for the 170s, which I think you should be, but even if you're not, even if you'd be happy with high 150s or 160s and so on, it still pays to think like a 170 scorer, because if you do, then you will increase your score significantly by better understanding the mindsets of the people who make this exam as well. So again, the agenda for tonight is coronavirus update, digital LSAT prep tests from LSAC, the mindset of a 170 plus score. And then of course, I know there are many questions on digital LSAT prep specifically that I will get into as well. Now, there is a chat function here in Zoom. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the evening, and I'll do my best to incorporate them into the conversation. So first off, the coronavirus update. LSAC has canceled March LSATs across Asia in China, Thailand, Japan, Hong Kong, and South Korea. The June LSATs may be canceled there as well. Some March LSATs here in the US have been closed, meaning students in those locations will not be able to take the March LSAT. More test centers may be closed as well. We'll see what happens as the situation unfolds. I think LSAC is closely monitoring the situation along with everyone else, of course. They have a page on their website linked on their homepage as well. I'm putting here in the chat if you would like to see more on that. But for anyone who's registered for the March or April LSATs pretty much anywhere, I certainly wouldn't count on being able to take it then. You might want to be thinking about June or July in addition or instead. We'll see what happens. For those of you who have already been admitted to a law school but might be retaking, you may have noticed, of course, that many admitted students' weekends at law schools have been canceled or been put online. If this is affecting you, I wouldn't let it impact your ability to connect with admissions officers, make a positive impression on them. And so if you want to set up a phone call with them or a video call simply to ask questions, that would be to your benefit, both to create a good impression and for you to learn more about the school as well. So definitely don't miss out on that opportunity. Law school admission officers are very accessible. They're very friendly. They want to help you. And they understand, obviously, if you can't visit the campus, especially these days. And so they will do whatever they can to share that information with you through another means. Digital LSAT prep tests. So LSAC has very recently just announced that they have put the vast majority of LSAT exams in the digital LSAT format. This new offering is called Official LSAT Prep Plus. They just released it last week. It's available through your LSAC account at lsac.org, specifically lawhub.lsac.org. I've put a link to it in the chat here, along with a link to an article of mine where I walk through exactly what it looks like. Basically, you're getting the vast majority of published LSATs in the exact same digital LSAT format. You'll be getting them on test day. This is the best way to prep for the digital LSAT, and it is available exclusively through LSAC on their site. It's $99 per year, but if you have a fee waiver or received one anytime in the past couple of years, 2 years, it will be free for you. So it's a great bargain, much cheaper than getting the exams in books of 10 and much cheaper than the previously available digital LSAT exams from private companies. So definitely well worth getting a subscription to that. I suspect that virtually everyone taking the LSAT will be getting an official LSAT Prep Plus subscription at some point over the course of their prep. If you're not ready to make the plunge on that yet, or you're just kind of feeling out the LSAT, learning a little bit about it, there are a couple of exams available through your LSAC account, specifically exams 71 and 73. And you can get 3 exams at familiar.lsac.org, but that's meant to be more of a familiarization tool just to show you what the exam is like in the digital. That's a recent update along with the coronavirus, of course. Now, the mindset of a 170 plus score, what goes into that process? So I have a lot of different thoughts on that. They're not necessarily cohesive. It's more just a general smattering of ideas I've had related to this, what I've seen that's worked for my students over the years, what I've seen that's worked for students in my courses, those I worked with one-on-one, and what I've seen from students elsewhere. Personally, I scored a 175 on the LSAT, but it took me a very long time to get there. my initial cold diagnostic was a 152, and my next several diagnostics were also in the low 150s. And I became increasingly obsessed with this exam the more and more I studied it. And as I was saying with a student yesterday who was experiencing burnout, obsession can be both a blessing and a curse. It can be a blessing in that you are willing to do whatever it takes, put in all the hours and days and weeks necessary to master this exam, even if it involves doing every single exam ever released, as it did for me. But on the flip side, the curse of it is that it can lead to burnout. And it can also potentially lead you to focus on the wrong things. What I noticed from students and what I've experienced myself back when I was studying is that you fall into this pattern of taking exam after exam after exam, measuring your results, being happy or sad about those results, and then moving on to the next one. And you might track your results in a spreadsheet or a Google Doc, charts and lists of questions you've gotten wrong. But if you're doing exam after exam, like maybe one a day or even more than one a day, you're not taking the time to fully understand them and learn from your mistakes. So my recommendation, instead of what I call this obsessive practice exam narrative, is to slow down, build the foundation first, and then review. My framework for LSAT studying is what I call the LASER approach to LSAT studying. LASER is an acronym that stands for learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. And it's the process that I see working for those who ultimately achieve top scores on the exam. Again, slowing down, building the foundation first. Learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. Learning is theory, reading textbook chapters, watching course lesson videos, building a basic familiarity with the exam. A is for accuracy, doing individual questions by type to better understand the proper perspective from which to view each one. S is for sections, doing individual timed 35-minute sections to work on your pacing. E is for exams and endurance, and R is for review. This is the framework, again, underlying my LSAT study plans. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I know I've covered it extensively in my other classes as well, but I did want to mention it briefly. I couldn't neglect to mention it, of course. Now, review. What does review look like? The last stage of LASER. This is the part that I think is most often overlooked from the vast majority of people studying for this exam, but it really is the key to unlocking their success. And so I've put together what I call the Socratic review method, which is a framework for understanding your mistakes, why you made them, and how you can avoid them going forward. So let's take logical reasoning as an example. You want to see where your misunderstanding stemmed from. Was it in the stimulus? Was it in the question stem? Or was it in the answer choices? If it was in the stimulus, what about the stimulus specifically tripped you up? How did they ramp up the difficulty level of the argument? And this is where it's really important to see the exam from the test maker's perspective. If you were trying to design an argument or design a reading comp passage and make it as difficult and confusing as possible, what would you do to increase the difficulty level? What tricks and traps would you lay for students? For reading comp, it's really apparent because reading comp passages are based on real world source material. It could be an academic journal article. It could be a book review in the New York Times, for example, as one of them is. And so you can see the source material and compare it to the actual LSAT reading comp passages. And they have boringified it or boringized the LSAT material to make it harder to understand. They include references that are kind of tangential to the topic at hand, plenty of different little asides here and there to throw you off, to shift your focus from what is actually the main point or the primary purpose of the passage. They might include conditional statements. They might take the contrapositive. They might separate different pieces of information that would be more comprehensible and smoother if you were to join them together. And if any of you are familiar with editing for English papers or research papers and such, you might be familiar with a tool called Hemingway, the Hemingway app, where you can copy paste text into a field and it'll show you how to make the writing more concise and more clear. And with LSAT reading comprehension passages, they fail this test big time. You copy paste one of those in and you're seeing that there's tons of run-on sentences. And so those sentences or clauses might be better separated from each other in order to make them clearer and easier to understand. LSAT is doing the opposite. They're basically turning them into something pretty similar to legalese, where they're burying the main idea, they're burying the lead. And that is not by accident, that is very much on purpose. So to bring it back to your review process, which particular tricks that they laid there for you to make it more difficult did you fall for? Was it including words like unless, except, until, or without? Was it failing to recognize conditional statements in the absence of key indicator words? Or was it that they buried the conclusion in the middle of the stimulus? Those are the kinds of things you want to look for. Then if your misunderstanding was in the question stem, was it some particular unfamiliar wording in a question stem? A lot of times on tougher questions, LSAC will reference common question types like flaw, strengthen, weaken in unfamiliar way using synonyms. They're breaking out their thesaurus, because if they can refer to a common idea in an uncommon way, it will be harder for you to spot it. It's kind of like they're putting a mask on it. They're obfuscating it, making it harder for you to recognize something that you actually understand pretty well. They're just dressing it up for you. Finally, if it's in the answer choices, if that's where your misunderstanding stemmed from, what specifically about the wrong answer choice made it seem appealing to you, and what ultimately makes it wrong? And what was discouraging about the right answer that pushed you away from it, and what ultimately makes it correct? You want to do this again and again and again. And you may even want to keep a mistake log or a mistake journal where you write out or articulate your thought process. You want to see if you can teach it to yourself or teach it to someone else, ideally. A mistake journal is great if you want to track it for yourself and if you have no one to talk to about this. But if you have a friend or a study buddy or a coach or a tutor, or you want to, if you have a kid or a nephew or niece and you want to explain to a 7-year-old, that could be a great way to prove to yourself that you truly understand it. A lot of times I ask a student of mine to explain it back to me and they can't, or they'll just reread the stimulus word for word. And that's cheating. That doesn't count. You don't truly understand it unless you can, without looking at the original source material, whether it's a reading comp passage or a logical reasoning argument, putting it aside, turning it over, looking away, and rephrasing it in your own words by memory to prove that you understand the general principle underlying the argument or underlying the passage. That is the true test of whether you truly understand something. And I can tell you personally that throughout my LSAT teaching career, I've been teaching this exam since 2005. I learned a lot on my own personal journey to get a 175, but I learned a lot more as I taught hundreds and thousands of students over the course of my career, because I was teaching the same question 20, 30, 40 different times, but not every method works for every student. So I had to keep developing different ways to explain the same concept or different methodologies until I found the one that stuck. And so if you're trying to explain to somebody who's not studying for the LSAT or someone who's not scoring nearly as well as you, it might require you simplifying it, dumbing it down, reframing it in different ways, making analogies to make the point more clear. And as you do that, as you talk it out, you better refine your own thoughts. I believe that speaking and writing and teaching is a great way to clarify your own understanding of a concept. It's too easy if you are trying to review something to just on your own, to just look at the correct answer or look at an explanation or watch one and say, I get it now, and move on. This process does not take 30 seconds. It doesn't take 2-3 minutes. It may take 10, 15, 20 minutes or more. My rule for practice test, Steve's practice test rule is maximum 2 timed exams per week and minimum 2 hours reviewing each exam. So max 2 tests per week, minimum 2 hours reviewing each exam. The reason for this is that you've got a lot of questions to review, and possibly more than you think that you do. Let's say you scored a 170 on a practice test, which is awesome. Most people probably aren't doing that consistently because by definition, 170 means you're in the top 3% of all test takers. But let's say hypothetically on a practice test, you got a 170. That means you got about 10 questions wrong on average. But there might have been another 10 or 15 that you weren't totally confident in, or you guessed and got lucky, you were down to 2 and got lucky, and it could have just as easily gone the other way the next time around. That means you've got 20, 25 questions to review, 20, 25 questions that you got to explain to someone else, articulate for yourself, or at the very least, write out in a mistake log or mistake journal. And I have an example of what that could look like from one former student, and I've put the example in the chat here of what his articulation looked like. And this is not the perfect way to do it. This is not the ideal explanation, but it is realistic. And I think any one of you could do something quite similar. Now, some other thoughts in terms of getting into the mindset of the test makers, getting into the mindset of top scorers. I want you to think about reverse engineering the exam to see it from the test maker's perspective, see how they would increase the difficulty level. And so rather than simply tell you my guesses or rehash what I said a little bit earlier, I think it could be useful for you to look at this on your own. Because I actually, as part of my own personal obsession with this exam, I managed to befriend a guy who used to write actual LSAT questions for LSAC. And I've conducted a series of written interviews with him, as well as video interviews with him. And I've put links to those videos and written interviews here in the chat. They're available on the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. I put these out as a public service just to help people get more access to someone who's really quite rare to hear from. He described the process by which LSAC trained him to write LSAT questions from scratch. And as you could imagine, they're quite picky about the questions they take on this exam. They're very tightly written. The people who write these questions are philosophy PhDs. And from reading LSAT questions and talking to this guy, I can certainly see how writing these exam questions could change somebody. And he really writes like an LSAT problem. The way he talks is like an LSAT problem, very precise, very articulate, and very specific with all the words he uses, and high-level vocabulary as well. It's not an easy job to get, and I have a lot of respect for the people who create this exam. They're very deliberate in what they do. So aside from this review process, or even writing your own LSAT logical reasoning questions or answer choices, another thing you could do that's probably a bit more accessible is writing your own LSAT logic games. I've personally written a half dozen or so of them myself, and I've enlisted a number of students to write their own logic games as well as exercises. And so I've put together a compilation of them, 10 of the best ones. The link to them is in the chat here as well. And so, I learned a lot personally by writing my own logic games. These are not just copies of LSAC ones with the topics changed. I wrote my own originally from scratch, although they were to some extent loosely inspired by real games. And I had a lot of fun writing those tempting wrong answers, discouraging right answers, the kinds of answer choices where a student could walk away confidently picking the wrong answer because I capitalized on the fact that certain students would make certain typical classic logical fallacies and confidently walk down that wrong path. So definitely check those out. But not only that, I want you to use those as inspiration for you to write your own mini logic games at the very least, because coming to see them from that perspective, I think you'll get a much better sense of what goes into making this exam and some of the common mistakes that students could make. Some other ideas for thinking outside the box here in terms of getting that top level understanding of the exam. You could film yourself doing LSAT problems. So you station a camera above your workspace, above your desk, and film yourself working through a section or working through a game, and later looking at the recordings to see where you may have spent too little time, where you may have spent too much time and gotten bogged down. And so you want to make sure, of course, that you avoid making the same mistake in the future. In terms of logic games, you could try memorizing the rules to build your short-term working memory. So you look at a game, you draw your diagram and draw the setup, draw the rules, then look away and see if you could recreate them all from scratch without looking back. And to make sure that your diagramming is clear and concise and consistent, could you look back at your diagram a week later, a month later, 3 months later, and thoroughly understand everything that you drew? Is it not only neat enough, but is your diagramming style consistent enough so that you could go back to it later and understand it? And could you, looking at a diagram, reverse engineer the game where you could relist all the rules that went into creating that diagram? I think this is really important to make sure that you thoroughly understand everything that you're drawing, because of course you can't do it all in your head. It simply is not realistic. It's not possible. There's a reason that phone numbers are typically only 7 digits, area codes aside, and that they're chunked 3 here, 4 there. We have real hard limits on our working memory, and there's no reason to try and push yourself too far past that, unless you're wanting to be a memory champion and compete in competitions or something like that. For LSAT purposes, make use of the scratch paper. You do get scratch paper on the digital LSAT, and I'll get into more of that later, but it's available to you. Make full use of it. For logical reasoning and reading comprehension, could you test your ability to really get the language of this exam and what they're typically looking for, where you could look at a stimulus or look at a reading comp passage and predict the answers without looking at the answer choices. So you read the passage, you look at the question stem, and then you pre-phrase or predict the correct answer. And only after you've written down or said out loud your own prediction, then you look at the choices to see, is this what they were going for? Is it what they had in mind? And how does your articulation differ from LSACs? LSACs, of course, as a way to make it harder, will be typically quite unappealing and not the way that you would have ideally worded it, but can you then match your articulation to LSAC's articulation? And over time, can you try to make your wording more like theirs, or at least understand how theirs relates to yours? On the flip side, could you, and this is really outside the box, could you, without reading the passage, read only the question stem and the choices, predict what the answer might be? And you might say, how could I possibly know the answer if I haven't looked at the source material, right? But the thing is that LSAC's correct answers have a certain rhythm and a certain pattern to them, and it typically involves not being too extreme a lot of the time, right? The tone will never be totally one way or totally the other way. It might be something like qualified approval, for example, so rather moderate in nature. And then for necessary assumptions and sufficient assumptions, there are certain patterns associated with those question types that I could get into in another context. But the idea is that there are certain degrees of tone or how extreme they are in what they're looking for, and you can use that to your advantage. Finally, for logical reasoning, when you see all that abstract or vague language, could you define it out of context? So when they say things like they're presupposing what they set out to prove, do you know what that means? Could you summarize it? Could you rephrase it more simply? Or words like in phrases like counter premise, subsidiary conclusion, and so on. Can you note those shifts in degree of certainty in the categories of things they're discussing? Can you note absolute versus relative comparisons? Things of that nature. The last thing I'll say, and then we'll get into digital LSAT specifically, of course, is that the general mindset I found to work best for this exam is to be extremely critical and skeptical of arguments, to not take things at face value, and to recognize how little it is that we actually know and we can actually infer based upon a given set of facts. I typically find that lower scorers tend to over-assume. They assume too much with the given information, and typically higher scorers tend to recognize that we can only infer to a certain extent, that our reasonable inferences or deductions are rather limited in nature. We can't go as far as we might typically think, or as LSAT would want us to go. So I have one example, one of my favorite LSAT questions of all time that I'll reference here just for purposes of illustrating this fact. There's an argument, I think it's from test 38, prep test 38, where they have a doctor who is a smoker, yet he wants to ban smoking in public places. Now, this is confusing and strange for a number of reasons. One of them is that we think doctors are supposed to be healthy, therefore they shouldn't smoke. But of course, that's not a reasonable assumption to make. Doctors are human beings, and they have all their behaviors just like anybody else. And so it's entirely possible that a doctor would be a smoker, even if they've been educated to know that smoking isn't healthy for them, for example. Secondly, we wouldn't necessarily expect a smoker to want to ban smoking in public places. We would expect perhaps typically that a smoker wants smoking to be available in as many places as possible so they have as much freedom as they want, as they could possibly have. But LSAC loves to make weird arguments that are somewhat counterintuitive. And so by playing on the unexpected, they lead students to make assumptions that are beyond the given information. So that's just something to keep in mind. And that pretty much closes this section of the conversation. I'm happy to entertain follow-ups and go back into any of this, but I know that there were many questions in mind that students had about the digital LSAT. And so I'll get into that now. I've got a big list of them here that were submitted prior to the class. I'm also happy to entertain more, either now or later as well. And so I'll just run through these one by one. So the first one was, have there been any glitches with the new digital LSAT system? The answer is yes, there have been many, many glitches. It's not a guarantee that you'll have a glitch, of course, but it's entirely possible. Some of the problems include tablets freezing, tablets crashing, the Wi-Fi at the test center not working properly. And all of that, of course, is entirely out of your control. The digital LSAT rolled out in July of 2019. It went full out in North America in September 2019. And since then, there have been a couple of LSAT administrations, each of which has been plagued by a number of digital LSAT tech issues or glitches. But LSAC is doing everything they can to reduce the number of issues. And of course, I think there shouldn't be any issues at all. I think they should have tested this more thoroughly before rolling it out. But they have their own timetables and they don't always move as quickly as they should or as we would like them to. And so hopefully the problems will become less and less with time. One thing you can control, though, is that the issue of glare on the tablet screens. And so when you walk into your test center, there may be fluorescent overhead lighting that creates a glare on your tablet screen. And you can tilt it to varying degrees. And that if you tilt your tablet screen, that may reduce the glare based on the angle of your tablet interacting with the overhead lighting. But if after you walk in, you are not able to tilt the tablet to a degree that makes it workable for you, before the test actually starts, raise your hand, speak to the proctor, and ask them to move you to a different seat. Explain the issue, and they should be able to address it. But of course, you don't want to bring this up when the exam has already started and the clock has started ticking. Better to address it sooner rather than later. And so that's really, I think, some of the biggest issues you might face with the digital interface specifically. Other problems in general that don't relate to the digital LSAT might be noise from outside, noise from the proctors. If you're taking the LSAT in the fall during a homecoming game on a college campus, of course, you may experience noise, and all of that, of course, is once again out of your control. If you face this as an issue, then of course I recommend you raise it to the proctors immediately, see if there's anything at all they can do. If not, then all you can really do is retake. You can write an addendum on your law school application, tell law schools about it, but the numbers are the numbers. Law school admissions is primarily numbers-based. It's your LSAT, then your GPA, then everything else. And so the answer I've heard from talking with countless admissions officers about this is simply retake, get the higher score. They don't really want to hear excuses. They know about the issues, their understanding of the issues, but at the same time, the numbers speak for themselves, and they never really know what you could have done unless you actually get the number itself. When it comes to prepping for the new digital format, what should you focus on? I think the biggest thing is get a tablet and practice with it. The digital LSAT is administered specifically on a Microsoft Surface Go 10-inch tablet. You don't need to get one of those specifically. Any old tablet would be fine. A Samsung, an iPad, an Amazon Fire. Any of those is perfectly fine, and those are the best way to prep for the digital LSAT specifically. On LSAC's site at familiar.lsac.org, you can do a few exams there. There are many more in the official LSAT Prep Plus, of course, and doing it on a computer doesn't really do it justice because you lose that touch screen experience, the interactivity. So definitely recommend getting a tablet. If you can't get one, it's not in your budget, or for whatever reason you don't have access to one, I would say borrow one or buy it and then return it. There truly is no substitute, and it is not very smartphone friendly, so I wouldn't really try to do it on there. And you're really doing yourself a disservice if you don't make yourself as familiar as possible with what the digital LSAT will be like. And I don't want to overstate the importance of this because it really is just a format thing, not a content thing. The content of the exam has not changed at all. It's still one section of games, 2 of logical reasoning, 1 of reading comp, then the experimental. But there are certain things you can do on paper that you can't do on a tablet. And namely, you can't draw freehand on the tablet the way you could on a piece of paper. And so if you're studying out of books, treat your books like screens. Don't write on them. The digital LSAT features on the Microsoft Surface Go tablet are limited to highlighting and underlining and changing the text spacing, things of that nature. Really not anything much more than that. So you have a highlighting tool where you can highlight in 3 different colors, orange, pink, and yellow, and then you can underline, but you cannot both underline and highlight the same text. And the problem here is that the tools for highlighting and underlining are not precise enough. So you might be trying to highlight one keyword, and instead you highlight 3, or you click and nothing gets highlighted at all. So personally, I'm not recommending students do any of that. I would just leave it alone and not count on it, and instead do all your work on the scratch paper to the side. You get a booklet of about 12 to 14 pages that is 8.5 by 11 paper, unlined, and you do all your work there. So diagramming for logic games, any note-taking for reading comp, anything for logical reasoning if you want to. You're doing all the note-taking there to the side. You can't do any notes on the digital LSAT itself, so I wouldn't count on them. But yeah, those highlighting, underlining, I think it's more trouble than it's worth. I think it's overly time consuming, and you've still got the same 35-minute time constraint per section like you did previously. As for the timer, there is a timer on the tablet. It's on the upper right. It counts down from 35 minutes, and you can remove it until you get to the 5-minute warning. Once there's 5 minutes remaining, a big box pops up that you must click OK to move on so that they know that you've seen it. And then the countdown timer stays there. This is kind of nice because it removes all the ambiguity about what you would be doing, about progress potentially messing up on the timing. So that's kind of nice. And bubbling no longer takes time to slowly fill in with a number 2 pencil. You're instead simply clicking or tapping and it's done. They do give you a stylus that actually has a pen on the other end for your note taking. So you could tap it, but that's pretty much it. Now, you might think that with the digital LSAT, you get your scores back immediately since you do for the GRE and the GMAT, but the LSAT is not like that. You still have your typical 3-week score wait until you get the score back. And I hope that this will happen faster with time. And they could at the very least give you a raw score conversion of what your score should ultimately be, but they don't for now. For now, you still got to wait the 3 weeks. And that's because LSAC does all kinds of detailed data analysis to make sure that students performed on the questions as they had expected, given the varying difficulty levels of different questions and the overall average difficulty level they want to achieve with that particular test form. So you do still have to wait a few weeks, not any faster than it was in the past. So during that time, I'll typically recommend that you, of course, try to busy yourself with other things, distract yourself, try not to obsess over it. Certainly don't spend too much time on forums because it can just stress you out even more. Work on your applications, work on your personal statement, getting your letters of recommendation together, and also take a break because you deserve it. You've been working really hard up to this point before the exam itself, I would imagine. And so anything you can do to take it easy or catch up on other things, definitely take advantage of that. Now, the writing sample. So the writing sample is digital as well, and you're no longer doing it at the test center. Instead, you do it later on your own time from home. You have up to about one year to complete it after you have done your official LSAT administration. So not before, but after that, you can do it the next day, a week later, a month later, on your own computer. I wouldn't recommend waiting too long because you might forget, and law schools do want to see your writing sample. And because it is typed on your computer rather than handwritten after doing 5 scored LSAT sections, law schools will be able to read it more easily because it's legible, it's typed, and because they have a higher expectation given that you're able to choose when you want to do it. So I would take it relatively more seriously than I would have previously recommended. So you're doing it from home on your own computer. It's still a 35-minute time constraint, but the content of the writing sample has not changed. You're still choosing between 2 options and making a reasonable argument in favor of one over the other. So I would say do it probably a week later after you have some time to recuperate and decompress from the actual LSAT. Choose a day, knock it out, don't stress over it. Maybe take 25 minutes to type it out, then another 10 minutes to revise and edit whatever you've done previously. And there is spell check, which is nice, so that's a plus. Still though, I think the major reason they have the writing sample and the major cases in which they would look at it are if you are a non-native English speaker and they want to evaluate your writing ability, because obviously your personal statement could have been written or edited by someone else. But the writing sample is truly unfiltered. They know it's you. They actually have a webcam on you during the writing sample to make sure it really is you doing it. They have you hold up your government issued ID to the camera to show that it's you, and then they match it to your face. And they want to make sure, of course, that nobody else is in the room. So they do have some security procedures in place. So again, the cases are non-native English speaker. They really want to look at it closely. And if your English or writing grades in college weren't as good as that you might have liked them to be, they want to see, do you have the writing ability? Because law school, of course, exams do involve a lot of writing. Lawyers need to be able to write a lot. And so they want to really check and evaluate your writing ability there. So do take it seriously no matter what. It probably can't help you a ton, but it could hurt you if you don't do a great job on it. So really do give it your full effort. But again, 35 minutes, you choose when to do it. So make the most of it. Finally, the last question I had here previously submitted was on the pricing. So digital LSAT pricing, what is it? It is $200. It is the same pricing as the paper and pencil LSAT. It has risen quite a bit over time, but it is what it is. And with a fee waiver, if your income meets the requirements, you could potentially get a couple of administrations for free, in addition to getting the official LSAT Prep Plus, those digital LSATs, getting those for free. So that's something. And I know it's a lot. Nobody likes to give LSAC more money in fees, but if you think that you'll need to retake, I would make the investment, because if you could get even a single point or two more on the LSAT as a result of retaking, that could translate into tens of thousands of dollars in scholarship money or getting into a better law school. So retaking or taking it again is really a no-brainer from that perspective, even if it is costing you the $200. And if as test date gets closer, you feel like you're not ready, if you can postpone your date before the deadline, you could potentially keep at least some of your registration fee and apply that towards a future LSAT test date. So I'm happy to entertain more questions on anything I've covered up to this point. But I do have a number of questions here in the chat that I will address now. One of them is with regards to setting up a study schedule. Of course, I covered my framework, laser, learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. And at the link I share with you in the chat, I have some free week-by-week schedules available to you. And I have, of course, special study plans associated with my courses that are customized to the courses, showing you exactly which course lesson videos to complete before doing relevant practice problems of that type. So that would be my first starting point there. Of course, they are just general frameworks. You will always want to adapt any study plan to your own personal situation. So my study plans involve games, then reasoning, then reading comprehension, building on each portion. So I'll say basically, read these articles, watch these videos, then complete these specific LSAT problems out of these exams. And I'll say do the ordering games, then grouping, then combination games, but because that's generally easy to hard. But within each category, I'll say do the easiest ordering games, then the intermediate ordering games, then the toughest ones, then easy grouping, moderate grouping, difficult grouping, and so on. Then I'll start with logical reasoning once we get to that, but I'll still mix in games along the way so you don't get rusty on them. And then finally, I'll pull it all together with reading comprehension, then full-length timed exams, and of course, review within that laser framework. As far as making the investment in materials, again, just like registering for the LSAT, it's worth the investment. If you think a single resource could help you, whether it's $20 or $50 or $100, if it gets you another point or two that translates into $5,000 in scholarships or $10,000 in scholarships or getting into a better law school, the ROI on that over the course of your entire career is huge. And so anything that helps you even just a little bit, either helps you save time or avoid doing the wrong thing or give you a clear and concise plan of attack, to me, that's a no-brainer. So definitely take advantage of whatever resources that you think could help you. And many resources, mine included, typically include money-back guarantees. And so there's really no risk involved if you think something could help you, whether it's my study plans or my explanations or my courses themselves even. If you can't afford a tablet, coming back to that. So if you can't afford a tablet, could you study with a book alone and take the exam without practicing on the digital format? Yes, you could. I think that it's better if you can use a tablet at least once. Find somebody, get resourceful. Find somebody who's willing to lend you a tablet for an afternoon. So you could at least do one exam timed in the digital LSAT format. If your budget's very limited, find somebody generous who you know, or a friend of a friend even, who you could borrow it from for an afternoon, do a full-length exam so that you're at least a little bit more familiar with the digital LSAT format. I mean, really, I hope that you would consider it worth your while to ask your general network, post on Facebook, post on Instagram, ask all your friends, send a group text and a group me or something. Find somebody who will lend you one. I think it's well worth it. Now, if you are isolated somewhere, let's say you're in the Peace Corps, somewhere rural, and there are no tablets around for 100 miles, could you study for the LSAT only with your books? And then later go to your test center overseas and take the LSAT having never touched a tablet? Yeah, you could. I mean, technically, I suppose with my example, overseas, it's still paper, so that's not the point. But if you could not get a tablet, could you take the digital LSAT and still do well? Absolutely. Especially if you are relatively comfortable with technology. These aren't the most complicated devices in the world. I just think it'll save you a little bit of time knowing where's the countdown timer, how does the highlighting work, how does it work to eliminate answer choices and flag them to come back to later. How does the screen work? I think all that would be useful. You can get a look at it, quite a bit of that with the familiarization tool, even on desktop. So you don't need a tablet, but I do think it would be a nice to have. Now, can the test be done in a written format with accommodations versus digital? Great question. So the LSAT is entirely digital now in North America, with some rare exceptions. And those rare exceptions would in fact be for certain cases that involve accommodations. And so if you think you might qualify for accommodations that involve taking it on paper, of course, I would apply for those accommodations as soon as possible, contact LSAC, get that sorted out because there are deadlines and it does take quite a while in order to actually get those accommodations. I don't think that ADHD accommodations specifically tend to get the paper LSAT format. I think those are typically more in cases involving some sort of physical impairment or disability, like a visual impairment or something else physical. I don't know all the specifics, but I would certainly look into it. But the vast majority of test takers in North America are getting the digital format. Those overseas in Europe, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere, they're all getting the paper format for now. Although I expect with time, perhaps in the next 3 to 5 years, as a rough guesstimate, it will eventually go digital. But I think LSAC really wants to refine all the glitches and such, and then figure out the logistical barrier of getting the tablets to all these widely disparate testing centers and making sure they're secure, making sure they're updated and the battery's not dying, things of that nature. As far as accommodations for extra time, LSAC has been sued a number of times over the years for being too stingy and strict with accommodations. Finally, after one too many lawsuits, they've loosened quite a bit on that. And since then, I haven't really heard of anybody being denied accommodations who had the proper paperwork. And so, especially for those with ADHD, if you get a proper evaluation and you get your paperwork together on time, you can typically get 50% extra time, meaning that instead of having 35 minutes per section, you could get 53 minutes per section instead, which is a significant boost, especially, of course, if you need it. Some folks will get double time. I've had a number of students who had double time, and I don't recommend going for that because it makes your testing day really, really long. I mean, if you think about it, 5 timed sections with 35 minutes each typically works out to being around 3 hours, a little bit more including the break. Now, with double time, that's getting closer to 6-7 hours, especially if you get extra breaks as a result of getting the extra time on top of that. So 7 hours on the LSAT is really a long, long time that I wouldn't recommend for most students. I think that 50% extra time is a good amount that really tends to lead to a positive net result. So I hope that addresses that. But again, if you think you might qualify, get everything in order sooner rather than later. Get your evaluation, get all the paperwork together. LSAC has a lot of detailed requirements on their site that I would recommend looking into. If someone's asking, the digital LSAT, has it become easier because it's in a new format? And the answer is no. The LSAT is of equal difficulty as previous. They haven't made it any easier. They haven't looked to make it any harder. This is simply a format change. They are not messing with the content at all, either in terms of the types of questions they ask or the average difficulty level. If we look at the most recently released exam from November, it's not really any easier or harder than ones from 3 years ago. It's roughly the same. The LSAT does evolve over time, but I wouldn't look to tie that evolution of the content to the format change or the switch from paper to digital at all. So I hope that addresses that question. Someone was asking about in-person courses in New York City. And I'd say, honestly, these days with coronavirus, I don't think in-person courses are really happening too much anymore. I think that obviously there are some currently scheduled, but I suspect that over time, a lot of those will be canceled and go online instead. I'm personally not holding any in-person courses, although I did quite a few last year, just because I don't really know what's going to be happening in the next month, next 3 months. And most in-person events are typically being canceled or postponed these days. And so I think prepping online is probably the most reasonable course of action that you can count on. And there are many, many more online courses available than ever before, of course, mine included. So definitely, I would say stick with those for now. You could potentially look into in-person if you're planning on later this year or the following year, but I wouldn't count on it in the short term. Reviewing reading comprehension, I talked about the Socratic review method for logical reasoning and context there. For reading comp, I think a lot of the same ideas would still apply. So looking at where your misunderstanding stems from, the passage, the question stem, the choices, looking at the tempting wrong answers, discouraging right answers. And for reading comprehension in particular, I would say that they're really good at making the right answer seem especially unappealing in reading comp more than any other section. It's typically not the way that I would have worded it or that most people would have worded it. So I would see to what extent you can match your pre-phrase back to the language or the wording in the given answer choice. And a lot of times, for the wrong answers, they will make it half right, half wrong. So the first half of the choice looks pretty good, but then there's typically one key word in the second half of the choice that makes it technically wrong. One little word where they get a little bit too extreme or push the limits a little bit too much. So, for example, they might shift the degree of certainty from being sometimes or many times or most times to always, or broadening beyond the category of things they were discussing. So rather than saying, for example, all people who take the LSAT, they could be saying all people in general. Big difference between those two, obviously. All people who take the LSAT is a qualified grouping. They're limiting the scope of what they're talking about. But to then zoom out and make a claim about all people in general is far too extreme. But because they're oftentimes using a lot of the same language or the same phrases, it seems like a match, but in reality, the meaning is not the same. It's not equivalent in meaning. So that makes a big difference. As far as books to use, I recommend sticking with the actual official LSAT prep tests published by the Law School Admission Council. If you're looking for the printed books, they're available in books of 10 for about $20 each. But if you're taking the digital LSAT, I would recommend also getting that official LSAT Prep Plus to take the exams in the digital format. But if you're looking for books on paper, for studying on the go, or just because you prefer using paper for a lot of your prep, then I would get the prep test books from LSAC. A lot of the other books from other companies, they'll oftentimes use fake LSAT questions, or which are problematic because they contain errors and are oftentimes unrealistic. And so you'll see in a lot of the Amazon reviews for these books containing fake questions that people are complaining it had typos, it had mistakes, it wasn't realistic, or they may be using really, really old exams because the licensing fees are cheaper and they want to save money. The problem is that the oldest exams, like I'm talking from the early 90s, they're technically useful and technically the same format for the most part, but they don't really reflect the full evolution of the exam. If you're studying for the exam within the next, looking to take it within the next 3 to 6 months, I would typically recommend limiting yourself to exams published this millennium, exams administered this millennium, which would be exam 30 or so up to present. And we're now currently at exam number 89. So there are, what is that, like 60 exams or so? That's plenty of exams to study from. You don't need to do all 100 or so. So I'd say if you're looking to take it in the next 3 months, you might want to work on the most recent 15, 20 exams. If you're taking it 5 to 6 months from now, I might look at the most recent 30 or 40 exams. But budget them out for yourself, make a plan. And here's the link to my plans again, since someone was asking about those. I've got free week by week ones. I've got paid day by day ones. And of course, for the students in the courses, I have special study schedules for course students as well, showing you how to use the course video lessons in conjunction with the study plans. I have a question on score averaging. Do law schools average multiple scores, or do they only take the highest? They only take the highest score. They do not average multiple LSAT scores. A lot of misinformation out there about this, because prior to 2006, law schools were taking the average because that's what the American Bar Association asked for. But starting in 2006, they made a switch where they only ask for the highest score instead of matriculating students. And so that's all that is considered in the law school admission process. So there is really not much of a downside to retaking the exam. You could take it 2, 3, 4 times, totally fine. They will only calculate the highest score when determining your chances. Now, they will see all scores, but that's not really a big deal, because again, they're only calculating the highest. That's what goes into the US News rankings calculations, which is what they are extremely concerned about. Now, if you take it 5 or 6 times or more, that might start to look a little bit like you're not really sure what you're doing, or that you're not really making the best decisions about taking it when you're fully ready. But 2, 3, 4 times, totally fine. And if you're taking it more than that, maybe you'll want to write a short addendum explaining what was going on. But I think for most students, 3 or 4 times at most would be sufficient, unless something goes terribly wrong at the test center. Now, scores are good for 5 years. They're on your record for 5 years. And so after that time, they expire and are no longer seen by law schools. And so you'd want to retake it in that case. But they're taking your highest score, and that highest score is from one single administration. They are not doing what's called super scoring for the SAT, for example, where they're taking multiple from different administrations. They don't see how you did on games versus reasoning versus reading comp. They're just seeing your score out of 180, and that's it. But I want to thank everyone for coming tonight and for all your excellent questions. I really do appreciate your taking the time and showing up so powerfully despite all the chaos going on out there. Please feel free to keep in touch. If you have any questions or need anything at all as you move forward with your prep, I'm happy to help however I can. Again, I've got the LSAT blog, the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast, and I'll send an email afterwards with some follow-ups with more resources related to that. So again, thanks everyone for coming, and have a good night, everyone. Take care. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.